Charlie.
Okay, welcome back. Ways and Means is here with Julia Richter from the Joint Fiscal Office. Do it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Julia Richter, JFO. Mr. Chair, would you like me to go through the next excess spending slide deck? Okay. So this is also on the committee page under my name. We just walked through went through the questions of how would the excess spending be raised, right? And now we were going down that branch of questions and the mechanics within the bill. Now we're pivoting a little bit. We're still within the excess spending policy question. However, now we're talking to Rep. Feltus's earlier question about a cap on excess spending and what it would look like, how it'd be calculated. Again, I'm nonpartisan, unbiased, no policy recommendations. So what do I have here in these slides? So I alluded to this earlier. I'm talking about some data and district boundaries of Vermont School Boards Associations, their regions. We've looked at this in prior modeling. This isn't because this is the district proposal, but because it was a district configuration that we looked at in the past. And the Chair Kornheiser asked for that to be the districts that we are looking at. We'll talk about calculating a cap in excess spending, looking at a broad analysis to sort of get a sense of scale, like what does 5% mean? What does 20% mean? And then a few considerations that I think we've talked about most of them, but they're laid out as I was thinking about them. So a brief review. This should all look pretty similar or familiar to you. It's from about a month ago. We're looking at FY25 data about these VSBA regions. I'm using here fiscal year 25 ed spending to give a sense of scale to a certain percentage of spending because we don't have yet a foundation amount or a base amount that I could be using for scale. So I'm not using this to say that the foundation amount would equal FY25 ed spending, but rather to give a sense of scale to numbers. These are the 11 VSBA regions. We've looked at them before. There is a slide deck on the committee page from, I don't know, a month ago where we walked through all of the pupil demographics across these regions and grand list values and grand list per pupil. So I haven't included all of that here, but I did just to sort of level set here, put up the high level numbers that we're talking about. So what we're looking at here are those 11 VSBA regions. What I did is I said, okay, what was the FY25 education spending of all of the districts that would be encompassed within that region? What is the long-term average daily membership, the pupil count with it that is encompassed in all of the districts that are within that region? And then I calculated what would be the ed spending per long-term ADM for that region. So none of these numbers necessarily should look familiar to you because what I've done is I've taken current law districts and aggregated up to these regions. I do want to note here what we're looking at is ed spending per long-term ADM. The legal term is long-term membership. This is not including weights, right? So usually we're looking at education spending per long-term weighted average daily membership. However, I didn't think it would be helpful to include long-term weighted average daily membership, given the fact that you are considering a foundation formula and perhaps different weights. So we're really looking at education spending pretty much per kid is a way to think about it.
Can I just clarify, it is pre-K through 12 in this example, or is it K
Yes.
through 12? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Pre-K through 12. And what we see, I just thought it was interesting, when we're looking at the FY 25 ed spending for long-term ADM, it's less varied than when we're just looking at education spending or long-term ADM. And this gets back to the point that we were talking about earlier. It's kind of a way to sort of equalize or compare apples to apples across districts, right? Central Vermont has more than double the education spending of Addison, but so too, it has more than double long-term ADM. However, their education spending is more similar, right? So that's the underlying data, sort of level setting, current state within these VSBA regions. So calculating a cap on excess spending. So this gets to the point that we were talking about however many minutes ago, about policy questions. When considering a foundation formula, one of the policy questions that we have been talking, or you all have been talking about, is are school districts permitted to spend above the foundation formula? Sort of question number one. If the answer is yes, then we get into all of these other questions. So if school districts are permitted to spend above the foundation formula, then the next question, one of the next questions is there a cap to how much they're permitted to spend above? Then we get into, okay, if the answer to that policy question is yes, there should be a cap to how much school districts are permitted to spend above the foundation formula, then the next set of policy questions are, what is the cap? How is it calculated? And there are different ways that a cap could be calculated. And this is what we were talking about earlier. You know, it could be calculated based on a district's funding amount, its foundation amount, its EOP. That's going to take into account some of those weights, right? The EOP is going to be based off of the weighted pupil count. It could be based off of a school district's student population, just the number of kids in the school district. So there's different ways. So draft 1.1 of the Ed Finance proposal creates a system where all school districts can decide to raise up to 10% of their educational opportunity payment, their EOP. So the cap is 10% above whatever their EOP is. Right? We know that the EOP is going to be calculated as the base amount by the district's weighted pupil count. So here's an example, also made up numbers. Well, this is a made up number, the 100 million. The school district's total EOP was 100 million, then it could spend up to 10 million in excess spending. So I thought it would be helpful to think about, and Rep. Kornheiser said, you know, it would be helpful to provide some scale into 10%, like in current law numbers, like what is 10%? How much money are we actually talking about? So one of the ways to do that is to look at the education spending per the VSBA regions. So again, it's not equal to the foundation amount, but this is to provide a sense of scale. So a lot of numbers here, I rounded them to 1,000 to try to make it a little bit easier to read. But what we're looking at here is within the VSBA regions, what their FY 25 education spending was. This is what we were looking at earlier. And then I just simply calculated what 5% of that education spending would be, 10% and 20%. So you can have a sense of scale. For instance, Addison with an education spending of about 96 million in FY 25. If the cap were to be 5%, then they could raise up to 4.8 million. If the cap were to be 20%, then they could raise up to 19.2 million. And of course, the larger the education spending, like in Central Vermont, the larger those numbers, but it's still the same percentage.
Representative Holcomb.
So what I'm trying to hold in my head is that this is making assumptions around current allocations. This is based on current allocations of funding. If we're adopting a new funding formula, first of all, how high that foundation level of spending is going to interact with these percentages and how necessary they are. But the other thing that we can't tell is if our funding formula is evolving how we weight, we may actually be redistributing dollars across these districts in ways that we don't know, but we also don't know how well they're able to accommodate, right? So that's where the percentages become significant.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I do want to really caveat here, we're using FY 25 ed spending because for right now, I don't have another number to compare percentages against nor proposed district boundaries. So this is some way to give sense of scale. And of course, all of those factors would influence this.
So. Yeah. Just thinking about, if it's the education opportunity grant, that doesn't account for any, I know we shouldn't use local revenues, any other revenues that are raised to support a school's operations outside of public funding. So if there's philanthropy or if there's a bake sale on steroids. So if somebody is really providing that amount of money for the operations of the school, that's not going to be calculated in the percentage over the educational opportunity grant.
Correct. And this education spending, again, I'll remind you all is that technical term is the school district's budget less offsetting revenues. So less federal dollars, less categorical aid from the state, less tuition revenues that are paid in, stuff they've pulled out of the reserve.
Assuming that in the future state, that really wouldn't exist to the same degree.
Federal funding.
Federal funding or reserves, I guess school districts would still have reserves, right?
It would sweep into the new district. We assume, right?
You might have reserve from year to year, it doesn't go back to the state.
Local.
That's a question, I don't know.
What is being proposed in the foundation formula, I don't know. I'll be interested to hear if John knows. Under current law, reserves are held within school districts.
Like Brian, like council, I don't know.
I think. Representative Feltus.
This FY 25 ed spending is what we spend now, which comes from the ed fund, which is property taxes as well as sales taxes and use taxes and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas this additional amount of 5%, 10%, or 20%, if we have the excess spending arrangement, would come from only property taxes.
As is being contemplated in draft 1.1, yes.
So a particular district would raise their Bennington, their $110,000, or if they don't raise it, we all raise it. And we use sales taxes to supplement, to come up with this 110,000. But if they want to spend another 5 million, it's only on local property taxes.
Correct.
Correct, the way we have it
Through
now.
the mechanism that we, as is contemplated in draft 1.1, through the mechanism that we just walked through.
Right.
So
Okay.
for instance, we would need to look at which, if these were the districts, we would need to look at which district has the lowest grand list value per pupil.
Mhm.
We would then need to multiply it by that 80 cents. Well, not multiply, but then we would need to do the 80-cent calculation. Then we would need to look at the excess spending per pupil divided by the yield. So we would need to go through that all of those steps.
Yeah, I guess what struck me was that the preponderance of the value of the property tax is much greater in this excess spending category than in the whole spending.
Yes.
In terms if you're thinking about a burden on property tax folks.
Representative Brannigan.
Can schools use this excess spending maneuver here to pay for transportation?
I don't know. I don't know if John knows.
We don't know what's gonna happen with transportation.
So the things that you don't know, are they yet to be done by us?
Yes. Yes, well, I'm saying that I don't know, it's not just me expressing that I haven't done my job.
We would never do
I hope that's not the way that it is.
No,
We never doubted that.
no, really, it's not the way it came across.
Representative Holcomb.
So an independent school sent out a letter a couple months ago saying it raises almost $6,000 per kid to bring down the cost of tuition. They wouldn't need local spending to cover that additional bump up because of that, right? So that they could, it does private fundraising effectively lower tax liabilities in ways that reduce contributions to redistribution through the weighted formula and the SOB.
Through the excess penalty.
I'm teasing Charlie.
I know, but I can't say that. Can private funds be used? I see John leaning over.
Yeah, I mean, the only thought that I have on this is that, you wouldn't need to vote the same amount in excess spending to raise if you have alternative funds available. So I think to that extent, yes, you would reduce the excess tax rate that you need to impose to raise a given amount of funds because you would have an alternative source. But it would just come down to, you wouldn't include that in the budget that you go out to vote on.
And I would also add in current law, if school districts have other revenue sources, then that is going to count as an offsetting revenue, decrease their education spending, which will pull down their local homestead property tax rate.
But it doesn't if it's done on the private side. It only does if it's part of a public district.
Correct. Where I was thinking of was if it's pulling down the cost of tuition for public students, then the sending schools will not need to be sending as many dollars.
Right, which reduces their tax liability
Correct.
and their contribution to redistribution.
Yes. Okay. So those were the only numbers that I put in this slide deck. And then these are some of the considerations that I just wanted to put into words. Gets back to this question of different ways to calculate the cap above the EOP. And the way that cap is calculated really will impact the amount that excess spending that districts are permitted to raise. So not just the percentage, but what the percentage is based off of, right? If it's a percentage or if it's a dollar amount. So for instance, the way that the draft is currently, the cap is a percentage, 10% based off of the educational opportunity payment. So this excess spending that's permitted is going to factor in the weighted pupil count because the education opportunity payment is calculated off of the weighted pupil count. So that means that districts with higher weighted student counts would be able to raise more excess spending overall than districts with lower weighted student counts. Calculating a cap based on pupil count would not factor in pupil weights, meaning that districts with the same pupil count would be able to raise the same excess spending, regardless of differences in the weighted pupil count. That's a policy choice, but I think it's one that I wanted to flag. And that's all I put together here.
Okay, so if the first question is, should districts be allowed to spend more than the base? Second is, if yes, then should there be a cap on the spending above the base? And the third question is, how do we calculate that percentage increase over the base? Is it percent over the education opportunity grant or EOP? What's P?
Education opportunity payment.
Payment, yes. Education opportunity payment or the percent over per pupil. Okay.
Or something else. I mean, I put those two in there as a way to sort of allow people's minds to get around policy question. But yes,
So our current excess spending threshold, how are we calculating that by comparison, just to be able to say?
so under current law, you have the excess spending threshold, right? That was put back into play in the yield bill last year. I believe last year. That what is 118% of the average statewide per pupil education spending inflated forward per NIPA, the inflation index that's used throughout Title 16. So it's 118% based off of the average. It's inflated forward essentially.
Okay. And you showed us 5, 10, and 20.
Yes, and that was a Julia decision because they're round numbers.
Yep.
And because current law has 118%, so I put for the excess spending threshold, so I decided to put 20 as the upper bound, but that would be a policy choice.
Do we currently have any restrictions or definitions of what the excess spending may be used for?
No,
In current law, the excess spending is just, you could spend it on anything?
yeah, and in current law, the way that the excess spending penalty works is essentially it calculates the threshold, right, 118%. And then if a school district has education spending above that threshold, then the amount that is above that threshold is double taxed, it plays in twice into their calculation of education spending. So it's a different way of talking about excess spending than what we've been talking about before, because essentially it's a tax penalty for excess spending. There's one carve out, and there used to be a lot more with the reinstitution of the excess spending penalty. All of those carve outs were done away with, and there's one carve out for principal and interest bond payments that were approved prior to the passage of the excess spending penalty. John, did I miss anything?
No, that's right. Yeah, July 1, 24.
So Representative Feltus, right now, the school districts are limiting how you can spend that money by approving the budgets.
By approving the budget, if they say we want to have more field trips, or because we want to add 3 more French classes than we already have, or we want to do these other things, it's going to cost us another 18% or more than 18%. And they choose to spend it.
So theoretically, the school district would still have to justify the extra spending for the school district and what it's for when they go to the voters. But the state is restricting how you can spend that money.
Excuse me.
Practically speaking, budgets are fungible. I don't know how you could control what they do, because if you said you didn't like their French program, they'd say, okay, then this is for my science program. I mean, I think
Right.
what they're trying to do locally is figure out what they need. And I would just, having been on the other side, I would just say that there's extraordinary cost associated with efforts on our part to micromanage school districts. It sometimes creates more inefficiency than benefit.
Under this discussion of excess spending, though, that would be voted on by the voters, because the foundation formula is just a flat amount. And if we want to go beyond that per district, you would vote on.
Plus weights. Flat amount plus weights.
Yeah, yes, I mean, the educational opportunity payment would just be calculated out and send a big check. Right.
Right.
To or whatever.
Representative Wazazi.
I think this is for John, sorry. Is there anything in the legislation now about when the voting would happen? Would just be on town meeting day is the assumption?
So that hasn't been settled either, and I will just say that part of the changes that I'll need to make are to update the existing voting provisions just to pick up this piece because you'll no longer need the voting provisions for the way the current system works. So we just need to choose a date for when that will, I think some of these discussions are around trying to coincide with other voting that is happening in the state.
Right.
But I don't know if that, how feasible that is. It's supposed to be November, right? And that presumably is not aligning with the calendars.
Representative Holt.
Did we ever get information on, thank you, sorry, thank you, Chair, on the interest on retained funds? I mean, these funds don't go to AOE now, they stay there and they earn interest while the allocations are fixed. And the bill proposes to pull all that money into the state, which means districts will lose the interest payments on that. And do we ever get an estimate of the value of that?
I have not gotten that estimate yet. I can follow up.
That'd be great.
Representative Higley.
Mr. Chair, and this may be a question for John as well, but, you know, Julia told us that, that SX spending for 1 year would go towards, you know, issues of, you know, miscalculations and stuff, correct?
In the reserve,
In the reserve.
as the bill is currently drafted,
Yeah.
yes.
And then, as the bill's currently drafted, after that time, it goes into a school construction fund.
That's right.
But is there any established criteria for how schools obtain that money?
So there is, as part of H 454, updated language for the school construction program. So there's a whole application process that's built out. There's specified uses for the fund itself, like going to, so one of the eligibility conditions for school construction is that you have facility master planning occur. So one of the permissible uses of the fund would be that it could go toward that facilities master planning. But there's the separate question of how the school construction program can be funded in the first place. Obviously, this is one step or one proposal for addressing the school construction needs, but it's not, you know, the full answer to that.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
The other piece that I will add on that vein is the school construction program and the language that's set up is not currently proposing 100% of school construction costs. So there is the other piece, right, that under current laws, there's no school construction aid program and all of that is built into school districts' budgets and inevitably falls into their education spending. So there's the school construction aid program as is currently being contemplated with a number of outstanding policy decisions. And then the other costs that are not going to be covered by the school construction aid program.
And I guess the question there then is, when are we gonna come up with these other policy proposals for that construction? Is that this year, or are we lagging that for a year because there's no money going into it for a year? Or,
That's a question for you and your colleagues.
okay,
It's pretty well detailed, at least the structure for coming up with that in 454 in terms of the state aid for school construction advisory group and that kind of stuff.
There's just no cap.
And then this agency of education, yeah, it's great, except there's no money.
because I mean, you know, the guesstimation was what, 300 million a year?
20 years, yeah.
Ouch. Okay, thanks.
So do we have all the decision points we have to make on this then?
No, Jerry.
I just, again, it was just, should there be a cap? If we allow for it, if yes, what is the cap and how we calculate it?
We also have to have some discussion about outside revenues. In what way?
So we,
Well, maybe we should actually go back and get a lesson on what happened with the shark pool prior to Act 68, just to understand both the incentive, but also objectively, we had people using significant and consistent fundraising to bring down their local what is their spending. And that is different. There are different rules for different sectors that inherently disadvantage people who choose to operate their own schools as opposed to people who choose to educate through paying tuition. If somebody in the private side is getting a $20 million donation from the foundation for renovating a building, or if they're habitually raising $6,000 or $7,000 a year, that reduces the amount of the tuition that's being paid, which reduces their contribution and how much they have to raise off local taxes. And if they're a higher wealth district, it also reduces their contributions to redistribution. It creates, it's just a different set of rules and privileges compared to, say, Woodstock, which doesn't get $20 million donations from foundations and can't fundraise for its per pupil spending to bring down its tax rate. It's just not fair.
Okay, so we're comfortable with those? Please.
Yeah, I had one other, I think, big picture policy question that maybe I should have put on this slide, but it wasn't directly related. Is you've already spoken about it a little bit, but to the point of, are there any stipulations on excess spending? In terms of, yes, budgets are fungible, and some states put parameters around excess spending for certain initiatives or certain projects, or some sort of accountability or whatever. I just would raise that as a question.
Because again, if I can, because again, it's more concerning than ever because we're talking districts, not towns, right?
Districts now, to be, they're already districts, not towns.
So, do we want to delve into that last deck of slides? Do we want to take a 5-minute break and clear our heads a little bit, because it's a different subject?
Either way, Mr. Chair,
5 minutes.
that I help